Okay, my name is Ryan Leiterman. I'm a veterinarian with Crystal Creek and Spooner, and I just want to say thanks to you guys for coming out today, and thanks to UW Extension for having me. So Otto and Lynn both approached me and said, we seem to get the same questions over and over and over again from beef producers. Would you mind doing a presentation on the 10 most common problems that they deal with from a veterinarian perspective? And I said, sure. So kind of the roadmap, we'll talk about common diseases that you guys often encounter, talk about parasite control, some breeding and AI ideas, pregnancy testing options, and then my personal favorite, addressing problem calving. So I look at these three. These were on the list: foot rot, pinkeye, ringworm. I mean, on the list of pain in your necks, are these pretty high for you guys? Or they can be at certain times of the year. So I broke these three. I put these three in a group. And the reason I did is the skin is a huge organ. It may be kind of weird to think about skinning an animal and stretching it out and thinking about that as an organ, but it's really, really a big organ. And the neat part about the skin is that you can see it. So think about if you have a beef cow or a calf with a problem with its musculoskeletal system, or maybe its liver or its digestive system. You're not going to see that. But when we have diseases of the skin, it's actually kind of neat because we can visually see it. And all three of these, foot rot, pinkeye, ringworm, one thing they have in common is they're an infection. And all infections relate back to the immune system. Now, it doesn't matter if you're a whale or a human or a beef calf, there is a constant battle, almost like a teeter-totter, of infection and immune system fighting it off. And when you're healthy, the immune system's winning. When an animal is sick, all that means is the teeter-totter is shifted the other way, that the immune system cannot keep up with the infection. So prior to vet school, this was my understanding of the immune system. Yep, I believe in it, and I'm pretty sure if we didn't have one, we'd all be dead. That was it. Then when I went to vet school, we started looking at stuff under the microscope, and I got to see what actual chunks of the immune system look like and what they do. So I found this video, and the way this video works, before we play it, this is real, and it's a blood sample looked at underneath a microscope. And this is a white blood cell. Everyone's probably heard of white blood cell. They fight infection. These are your red blood cells. And these are little bacteria, okay? And now this doesn't happen this fast. This is sped up in the video, but this is the real deal here. This is happening in your blood. It's happening in my blood. It's happening in all of your animals' blood, where these white blood cells chase these bacteria around and they track them down. If any of you have hunting dogs, this is what a hunting dog does when you're pheasant hunting, or a coon hound or a bear hound. They chase it down. Now here's going to catch it, gobbles it up like a Pac-Man, and then inside of them they have little, essentially, bags of acid, and they stuff these bacteria in the bags of acid, they digest it, and they poop it out, okay? So if you don't think this is cool, I'm concerned you might be dead, because this is really cool. We'll just, I usually play this like 3 times because people want to keep seeing it. I mean, it just gives a face to the immune system that I didn't know was there prior to vet school. Okay, so when we talk about infections that animals are battling, it doesn't matter what the infection is, this is happening. Another thing I learned in vet school, I thought when we gave a shot of antibiotics, it killed all the bacteria and that's why the animal got better. That's not actually true. All antibiotics do is tip the scale back into the immune system's favor, and then the immune system can catch up. That's why, like, there's people in hospitals that are on IV antibiotics that die every day. When your immune system is shut down, you are going to die. There's no 2 ways about it. No amount of antibiotics can keep you alive. So it's really every animal, if they're sick, we give a shot of antibiotic or we give a treatment and they get better. That treatment or antibiotic just tilted the scale back in the immune system's favor, but it's the immune system itself that went around and cleaned up the infection. Any questions on that? One more time, or is twice enough? You can look videos up like this online if you want to see them, but I just think they're kind of cool and they help tell the story. So foot rot, this is what they'll teach you in veterinary school. It's a subacute or acute necrotic infection that originates in the interdigital skin, leading to cellulitis of the digital region. Before vet school, I didn't know half those words. This is what it actually means. It's an infection in between the toes, and like my grandma used to say, it stinks so bad it could gag a maggot. Has anybody, you know how they used to teach us to diagnose foot rot in vet school? This is what they teach you when you're a young vet. Stick your finger in there and smell it. And then if you go, oh, they're like, that's foot rot. Okay, I quit doing that, but that's how I train young veterinarians now if I spend time with them. So, and it's really a visual diagnosis. So I don't know if you can see here. This is an unaffected foot, and this is an affected foot here, and it's even swelling up the foot. This is the main part here. It's maybe a little more. I mean, it's not subtle if it's easy to see, but with the light in here, it looks maybe a little more subtle. But this one is much more swollen than here. You can see some swelling in between the toes here. This is a digit. This is a digit. So this is the interdigital space. You can see some swelling in between the toes. This is on a beef calf. This is really bad. These toes should not be this far apart. So when the swelling and infection gets this bad, it just physically spreads and swells. These are extremely painful. Sometimes these can get so bad, like on this one here, the infection can get in the bone. And when the infection gets in the bone, there's no amount of saving that. The only way to save that foot is to actually surgically remove one of the toes. And it is like a hatchet-style surgery. This is not neat and tidy in an operating room. This is, you take some abrasive wire and you literally just cut the toe off. The animal's knocked out completely and it's blocked up so it can't feel any pain. And they actually respond really well to that, believe it or not. We generally don't do this in bulls because for bulls, if it's on a hind leg, he's got a job where he's up on his hind legs a lot and you need two good toes on both legs to do your job as a bull most of the time. But for cows, these work fine. Okay, so the causes of foot rot, it's really a break in between the skin and the toes. It's a lack of good skin integrity. And there's a lot of reasons that this could happen. The most common, the most foot rot we see is a time when it's wet and muddy out. And I think I'm not saying anything that you guys don't already know. But another one is poor trace mineral supplementation. So keep in mind that this is a infection. And we showed the video of the immune system, and those immune systems are like little soldiers. And like soldiers in any country, they go off to war because they get paid. So, many of them have patriotic duty, but I'm willing to bet that if we didn't pay them, we would have a much smaller army. It is the same way in the immune system. And the immune system gets paid with a couple different things. Calories, so they just need flat out calories to go to work and do their job. But they also need vitamins and trace minerals. And when they don't get correct amounts of vitamins and trace minerals, particularly stuff like zinc is really important in skin health and hoof health, the integrity of that skin can be compromised. It's more likely to crack. If it's more likely to crack, it's more likely to get an infection. So if you have cracked skin and then these wet, muddy conditions, that's what predisposes to foot rot. Prevention is lot conditions, doing the best you can. I mean, that's easy for a guy up here giving a presentation. That's hard for people who are actually have to deal with muddy lots. And nutrition. Nutrition is one thing that I look at. If we're experiencing above average foot rot, I'll generally take a look at nutrition because I think that's a place we can make an impact. Other than that, you're looking at lot conditions generally. Treatment, there's a couple basic treatments. Penicillin and LA-200 are the best. Penicillin can be problematic because you have to give it, technically it's supposed to be given twice a day. LA-200 you can give a shot, 3 days later give another shot, and they're usually over it. If people are looking for non-antibiotic options, if you have good cattle handling facilities and you can actually get them restrained and lift a leg, you can do this thing, it's sugar and betadine wrap. Has anybody ever heard of that before? It actually works really good. So back in the day before people had refrigeration, they used to like salt cure and sugar cure hams. That's because they could get the salt and sugar so high that it would create an osmotic gradient that bacteria wouldn't grow. We can do the same thing. It almost like sucks the infection out of the foot. And believe it or not, I'm no tree-hugging hippie, but this is a good non-antibiotic alternative that works. But it requires a lot more management, and you have to have a place to catch your cattle. So if you're pinching them behind a gate, LA-200 is going to be your best friend probably. And pain management as well. A lot of times people focus on treating the infection, but I really think pain management is important as well. There's some simple pain management tools that you can use, and I think it's important when you see how bad those feet are swollen up. They can't even walk on those things. A lot of times they're kind of three-wheeling around. Pain management can be a really important aspect as well. It helps them get on feed back faster. Any questions on foot rot before we go to Pinkeye? Yep.
Other than zinc, what other trace minerals are important?
So things like your zinc, your copper, your manganese, selenium, vitamin A, D, and E is really big, all of those. So vitamin A, we recently had a big shortage worldwide. Believe it or not, there's only 2 plants in the world, if you can believe that, that make vitamin A. One of them caught on fire in Germany. That really messed up the vitamin A for livestock feed for a long time. We're back online now. That happened almost a year ago. And we came back fully online in about August of this year. So a lot of companies had to cut their vitamin A and their mineral levels down just because the supply was not there. I think it went from like $4 a pound to $160 a pound in a couple months. So it really, really skyrocketed. Moving on to Pinkeye, the veterinary definition is inflammation of the cornea and the conjunctiva caused by bacterial infection. The practical definition is you get white, sometimes pink spots on the eye. And a lot of times before you actually see the pink spots, you'll see some tearing associated with the eye. It really comes in 3 stages. So you can have a pretty mild one here where there's just some clouding. Then you start to see this little like kind of white dot formation. A lot of times they're the size of about a pencil eraser. And then when they get really bad, the whole eye is clouded like this. This animal's probably going to lose its eyesight. It'll very likely go blind. In some really severe cases, they can rupture. It can be pretty gross. It doesn't take a real long time for it to go from this to this. And that's why in beef cattle, we tend to see more severe ones. It's just they might not get eyeballed as much as a heifer in a dairy yard or something. So the biggest causes for pinkeye are any abrasion to the cornea. So I kind of equate it like this. Say you have your hand and you just stick it in a pile of cow manure and then you wash it off, you're probably not going to get an infection. If you take your hand and cut it all up and then stick it in a pile of cow manure and then take it out and wash it off, there's a much higher risk of infection because the integrity of the skin is compromised. Any abrasion to the cornea is going to make it much more likely to get an infection. And so when I was in practice, I had a dairy farmer who said, Ryan, I need you to come out and look at my heifers. I got a bunch of post-wean calves and they all got pink eye. And when I looked at him, I think he had about 50 heifers in this lot and every single one had pink eye in its left eye, which was just bizarre. And so the reason, I like to tell stories, so we're gonna go off on some tangents here. So the reason is he had a lot like this, and he had slant bars for feeding, and he'd put his feed out here. And all these heifers would come up and eat, and the wind would just come ripping out of this direction. He had some buildings and stuff, so it made like a little funnel, and the wind would just hammer in through here. And he felt really bad for him. He thought, it's so cold out here. So in the fall, he would always take corn stover stacks and stack them up like this. And he did this for years. Never really had any problems. But this particular year, it was a super dry and dusty fall, and those corn stover stacks were just full of dust, and the wind would just blow, and it would blow all this dust this way. I mean, I was standing there when we were looking at it, and the wind was blowing. It's like you're going like this, trying to get the stuff out of your eye. Well, here, it would blow that dust into their left eyes when they would come up and feed, and it caused so much abrasion, almost like sandpaper on their cornea, that they developed pink eye from that. So when I look at pink eye, it's a bacterial infection. In humans, it's viral, but in cattle, it's bacterial. Whenever I see a bunch of pink eye, I think 2 things. One is, what's abrading that eye? So things that can be practical for you guys are oftentimes longer pastures. When cattle will graze, if the pasture length comes up and can interfere and hit their cornea, that can be a big thing. So a lot of times, something as simple as keeping pastures clipped can make a big difference on pink eye. Has anybody experienced that? Had longer pastures and just clipped and seen? Yeah.
I'm working with some Southern online. We had rescue with all the problem. All you can flip it to the test and see in the eye.
Oh, sure. Yeah. How irritating that would be. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So yep. Go ahead, Lynn.
Another grass to watch on that is Reed's canary grass. It's very stiff on aftermath.
Yeah. So Lynn said reed canary grass, and I hate that grass for many reasons. One is I like to duck hunt, and ever since I was little, like 9 years old, it's like, 5 in the morning and the sun's not up and you're making your blind, and you would grab that stuff and go to pull it out, and it would just cut the daylights out of your hands. That stuff has really got sharp edges. And so me and reed canary grass have got a long-standing dislike for each other just because of that. And And again, I go back to trace mineral supplementation. I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but this stuff actually matters. And I know people that have told me, we battled with Pinkeye last summer really bad, and the only difference is we did a better job of vitamin and mineral supplementation to our animals, and we didn't have a single case of Pinkeye this year. I mean, I've heard stories like that from producers, and it really does matter. When you think about that immune system zooming around the body, nutrition impacts that, and it impacts it in a significant way. And the cool part is, with skin diseases, we can actually see those resolve through better nutrition. So prevention, pasture clipping is a big one, fly control. So flies are always looking for moisture in the summer, and they're gonna find it at the corner of cattle's eyes. And so they get, you get a fly's little feet. Anybody ever seen a close-up of a fly's foot? Looks like a plunger for a toilet, like a little suction cup. Well, they walk around there and they pick those bacteria up on their feet. And then they fly from one cow, they land in the corner of another cow's eyes, they walk around there, and they spread that bacteria everywhere. And if that cornea is at all abraded or irritated, that bacteria is just going to latch on and cause an infection. And vaccination. How many people vaccinate for Pinkeye? Show of hands. Got some people. So vaccination for Pinkeye, I could really go either way on. So they teach you when you're in vet school that the best vaccine would provide very long-lasting protection, and it would provide very good coverage, and we would use those vaccines. And then the poorest vaccines would provide very short durations of coverage, and even when you were covered, it wasn't that good. And so we have that spectrum of vaccines, and in general, Pinkeye tends to be on the lower end of the spectrum. You're lucky if you get 2 months of protection out of it, which is fine because that's really kind of the window that we need it for. But also the level of protection you get is really not that good. And so I guess I just leave that decision up to my producers. I've had some producers who bring in Pinkeye vaccines and say they really liked it and they don't mind that it's $2.50. I've had other people who don't want to use it. That's fine. It seems to work better on some farms than others. And there's some strains of Pinkeye that are a lot more aggressive than others. And so maybe that's where the vaccine works better. And things like fly control is really big. So fly tags, there's minerals that you can get that have fly control in it. So they have larvicides, so it kills the larvae. There's all sorts of different options. But really, pasture clipping, fly control, nutrition, and in my mind, plus or minus vaccination, if it's right for your farm, are really the best options. Pinkeye to me is not a significant economic disease, but it is annoying to have to deal with. It causes a lot of time for producers to have to deal with that. Treatment again, antibiotics, LA200 is a really effective treatment, especially for your early onset ones. And then they have these eye patches, which just make me laugh. I mean, you can glue this on. I don't mean to be cynical, but you can glue this on all day long. It's on because, I don't know if you can tell, she's in a chute. Yeah, that thing's gonna be off in about 30 seconds, I think, when she finds a T-post to rub that off on, but whatever. Some of my favorite ones, and this requires some time and some restraint, but you can actually take the third eyelid and sew it shut. Has anybody ever seen that done? It's a really simple technique. Veterinarians can do it in about 30 seconds or less. And they use a stitch that's dissolvable, so you don't ever have to go back out and take it out. After a couple of weeks, the stitch just dissolves and the eyelid falls back. And by protecting that cornea and covering it up, oftentimes it heals itself, doesn't require any antibiotic intervention, and it works really well. So that's kind of a cool option as well. I would recommend don't try it. Don't try it yourself. It's not overly complicated, but you got a needle right next to an eyeball, and it does take a little bit of skill. Any questions on Pinkeye? Yep.
Why is it whiteface tend to get it worse?
It's a great question. Why do whiteface tend to get it worse? You know, I don't know. I do think that is probably true. Maybe some pigmentation issue in sunlight, maybe that causes some irritation of the conjunctiva. I guess I don't know. It's a good question. They're more likely to get cancer in their eye for sure, and that's directly due to a lack of pigment and a sunlight issue. It's very hard for veterinarians to say, I don't know. We actually have a special class on that to teach us. So for ringworm, this is one of my favorite things to see in cattle because this is almost exclusively a nutritional deficiency. It's one of the easiest things that we can visibly see on the outside of an animal that just screams nutritional deficiency. Again, this is an infection. It's a fungal infection. People can get it, so just be aware of that. And it's generally this gray crusting, and you tend to see it pretty much from the shoulders up. I mean, I haven't really seen it much past the neck. Generally around the face, certainly around the eyes and the ears. This is vitamin A, D, and E. This is a big deal. When it comes to vitamins, now, generally vitamin A is very inexpensive, except when the factory starts on fire, then it shoots up. But generally speaking, vitamin A is cheap. Vitamins D and E can be more expensive. So what mineral manufacturers will do is they will put very high levels of vitamin A in their mineral and say, hey, look at how great this is. This is a real big number. You should buy this. And then they don't put much D and E in because it's expensive. And when you have a mismatch of A, D, and E, that's when you're going to start to really see ringworm. There's all sorts of like anecdotal treatments, but really it's just sunlight and time. If you have an animal with ringworm, sunlight and time are the best things to make it go away. I've heard so many stories of motor oil, kerosene, just odd things that could be put on there, and none of them really seem to speed up the healing process at all. These just take time to go away, but they're easily preventable. So any questions on the three kind of big diseases at all? So going on to parasite control, there's really three options for parasite control. There's pour-on options, injectable options, and there are some herbal treatments that have been shown to be effective. I will just say use caution with this. In my younger days, I did some research on some herbal treatments, and we found out that some of the stuff that people were using that is commonly talked about in the industry just has no efficacy whatsoever, and that there are some things that have been shown to have efficacy as well. So just make sure you do your homework on that. Okay, so I like this picture here. This is an overgrown or overgrazed pasture, but I like this picture down here. This is a droplet of water. Can you guys see those little white things in there? Those are worm larvae, and that is gross. That's right on the grass. And so when young animals come, or when animals come and graze that, that's how they're going to get infected. These larvae are actually shed in the feces, and then they crawl like a little inchworm up the grass, and then they sit on the grass blade waiting to get eaten because they know that's the best way to get back in the mouth of an animal. It's amazing how adaptive they are. So when it comes to internal parasites, we have a host of drugs that people use. Ivermectin is one of them. I just want to throw out a word of caution that resistance is real. We don't see parasite resistance nearly as bad in beef cattle as we do in sheep. Does anybody here have sheep? Does anybody know how bad it is in sheep? I mean, it's a bad deal. Like, we have one dewormer that really gets barber pole in sheep left. That's scary when you think about it. So I think regardless of what your deworming protocol is, it's good to rotate through different drug classes to try to minimize the chance of resistance. As much as resistance is real for parasites, immunity is real too. I'm a big believer in judicious use of dewormers. Adult cattle, unless they're immunosuppressed, you would be very hard pressed to find a parasite burden in an adult cow. They have a level of immunity and resistance that they develop as they get older. When I was in practice, I did not routinely deworm adult beef cows. When we would run pairs through the chute and we would do castrations and vaccinations, I would not deworm unless my producer was dead set on it. I did not recommend deworming adult cows. They do not carry a significant worm burden unless they are immunosuppressed. The ones who are our little parasite hoarders are young stock. Those calves that are about to be weaned, those are the ones that hold it all. I mean, anything that's from a baby calf all the way up to being weaned in our beef herd, those are the ones that are really carrying around the parasite burden. Just a little interesting thing here. I'm not real keen on ivermectin. It's cheap. It's been around a long time. It's certainly effective. But But there was a study that showed that the administration of ivermectin to cattle was highly effective in killing the dung beetle larvae for approximately 143 days after treatment. So that means you pour the cow with ivermectin, and then she will excrete an active form of that ivermectin in her feces, and it kills dung beetles. And again, like I said before, I'm no tree-hugging hippie, but these things matter too. And so the dung beetle, believe it or not, is a really important part of the ecosystem for breaking down patties and incorporating it into the soil. And there was some of this earliest work came in the 80s. There was a beef farm that had used ivermectin for years after years after years, and they found that their pastures, their manure patties did not break down. They had pastures that almost looked like feedlot conditions because the manure never broke down, because they had completely sterilized the soil of dung beetles. So there's other drugs out there that are not excreted in active forms and do not kill soil microflora like this. And I just think it's important. I mean, we talk about grazing cattle, and that this whole ball of wax starts with the soil and the grass, and that's why we're here. And there's a lot of microflora in the soil that are important, and I just think that we need to be careful that some of these drugs, just be aware of the fact that they might not be the most beneficial to some of that soil microflora.
What are you recommending?
Yeah, so, well, a couple things. So probably one of the more common ones is called Dectomax. It's a little more expensive. It's purple. It's amoxidectin. This is ivermectin. That's amoxidectin. They're like chemical cousins. But Dectomax doesn't kill dung beetles.
Okay,
So
Ivermectin is what I have used, but I don't worm unless I have a little microscope or something. I don't worm unless I see one, because I rotational graze.
yeah,
But I haven't seen dung beetles though either, so
a lot of times you won't actually. Have you ever seen a manure patty though that's got a bunch of holes in it, like it's dried out and it's got a bunch of holes? That's because they bore up through so they come in through the bottom. So you're not going to just see them cruising on the top. They'll come up underneath the dung patty and they'll take it and then come down. So when you look, you can tell if they're there or not, because you'll look at kind of a dried out old patty and you'll see all them holes in it. That's because dung beetles are starting to take that down, and they're really important in incorporating that back into the soil. So Sidectin is dung beetle friendly. So that's an option that I think you have. But to your point, there's a bigger issue, is can we be even more judicious? Instead of just switching to, say, Sidectin, is there a way that we can be more judicious and not deworm everybody if we don't need to? And there's things like the leader-follower system. You guys probably know more about that than me. Put your older stock first, let them eat up the grass that have all those nasty little worms sitting in the water droplets, and then graze your younger animals behind them once your adult cows have kind of acted like a parasite vacuum in a way. Get the parasites off the pasture and then put your young cattle back on there. That's an option that I think is legitimate. The other idea is this topic of refugia. Now, I know that this is a grazers conference, but does anybody here raise corn? Okay, so I didn't know this. A friend of mine lives down in Iowa, and if you live in Iowa, you're gonna raise corn. And he was telling me this topic that there's a certain amount of, is it rootworm? Is that right? Or something? The idea that you can't plant an entire field of rootworm resistant corn. You have to have some corn that's susceptible to it. Have you guys heard of this before? Yeah? Okay, so the reason they do that is they realize if we plant 1,000 acres of corn that is resistant to root grub or rootworm or whatever it is, and a couple of them can live, those ones that live obviously have the resistance gene, and then they're going to propagate and propagate and propagate. Now we're going to get a whole field of selected ones that are resistant. So what they do is they plant, I think it's 10% or something of the corn has to be susceptible to this infection so that they don't propagate the resistance gene. Now this is very popular in sheep, this idea of refugia. So let me try to draw this out here, because I don't know if that picture is as good. So this is more of a management tool that you'll be able to use that may minimize the amount of chemical deworming you have to do. Okay, if this is a cow, I did a presentation up in Ontario, and I did it last winter, and instead of a whiteboard, they gave me one of those sheets things that you you draw on and then you flip over like a big notepad. And when I got done, this guy came up real quiet and he goes, I'd like to give you $5 for one of those. Drawing is so amazing, I want to hang it in my house. And he goes, I didn't want to say anything during the presentation for fear other people would want it, and then we get in a bidding war, and I'd have to pay a lot of money for it. And so it apparently it's well known I'm not a good drawer, is the point of that story. But if this is a cow, and she's got some parasites, and let's say there's a bunch of parasites that are S for susceptible to being killed by a dewormer, okay? And then she's got a bunch of parasites that are R, which are resistant, okay? Now the common thing to do, and this inherently makes sense, is in the fall, we're gonna deworm her, and we're gonna kill all the S's, right? By definition, they're sensitive to the dewormer. And then once we deworm her, we're gonna go put her on a clean pasture, okay? And now we're gonna put her over here in this paddock, and now all she has left is R's. So guess what she excretes out in her feces, in this pile of manure, is a bunch of R's. Okay, these R's come back up onto a blade of grass. They get eaten by another one. And by doing this year after year after year, we have just selected to create a very resistant population. Does this make sense? Okay? And I mean, like, deworm them and then move them to another pasture. I mean, that is like always made sense in my mind. And it seems like it's actually kind of backwards now. So now what they're doing, this is way more common in sheep where resistance is a real problem, is they're not deworming everybody. They're only deworming the ones that have such a bad parasite load they're gonna die. And then the other ones they leave, they don't touch them at all. Okay, so here's option number 2. Okay, if we have a whole herd and there's a couple that we didn't deworm, a bunch of these susceptible parasites are still gonna be here. So now when we move them, they're gonna be excreting susceptible and resistant ones. And what this does is instead of creating a pure strain of resistant ones over the course of like 10 years, we keep a population of susceptible parasites in the herd. A present susceptible parasite is better than a present resistant parasite. Does this concept make sense? I mean, it kind of blows your mind, or my mind, because it goes against a lot of what I was taught 10, 12 years ago in vet school. But the idea of understanding that if we try to get every single parasite out of every single animal, we're not gonna do it anyways, and then we're just gonna create a big population of resistance. The idea of selectively treating the animals that are carrying a significant parasite load is, in my opinion, parasite management wave of the future for sure. And that's to your point, looking at stuff under a microscope and saying this group of animals is not significantly parasitized, I'm not going to treat them. This group of animals is significantly parasitized, I am going to treat them. That is a lot better approach in my mind than just pouring everybody and moving on. So the idea of refugia, you can look it up on the old interweb, type in refugia, and you can learn more about it and maybe learn more than, or a better way than I explained it. But the idea of keeping some susceptible ones behind is really important. Any questions on that? It can be kind of a hot button topic. I'm waiting for a heckler here somewhere. Yeah.
Does that concept work with liver flukes?
Good question. So does the concept work with liver flukes? Liver flukes are really hard. I'd rather just try to kill all of them. So liver flukes can really wreak some economic havoc, and they're just hard to deal with anyways. Like, not all of our commercial dewormers get them, and they're just a nasty little devil. It's actually gross to think about. They have what's called a hepatotracheal migration. So just think about this. They're ingested. They go through a life cycle phase in the intestinal tract of the animal. But then to complete their life cycle, they burrow through the intestine. They actually go through the body of the animal, through the liver, and sometimes they'll even make it to the lungs where they're coughed back up and eaten back in. I mean, they actually like bore holes right through the animal. I mean, it's just amazing. At least many of the other parasites have the decency to stay confined into the intestinal tract, you know? So yeah, that's a good question. And then that gets into a whole other thing of management of like fencing off ponds and trying to prevent the snail because the snail's needed in the life cycle and all this stuff. Liver flukes are a battle. They're probably one of the hardest things. I think they're probably even worse than pinkeye and foot rot and that kind of stuff.
I was using the Ivermectin Plus for the liver flukes, and the last couple of times I tried to order the equipment. Is that available?
So this guy's question was, I used Ivermectin Plus for liver flukes, tried to order it recently and can't get it. I'm not sure on that, if it's still available or not. And I believe Sidectin gets liver flukes, but I'd have to go back and look at the label. I can't remember offhand. I think it does. I don't know if Safeguard does. Sidectin does, okay. And I don't know if Safeguard gets liver flukes or not. Does anybody else know? Yeah.
So do you know, would we do that every year then, and what time of the year should that be done?
For liver flukes or just deworming in general?
Liver fluke.
Yeah, good question. They're gonna pick it up when it's wet out and there's liquid water and they're getting access to the snails. So the school of thought could be deworm them in the fall so they're clean going into the spring, or deworm them in the summer once they're halfway through getting liver flukes. Part of it is, and I hate to say this, see, when I was in vet school, I thought everything was perfect. I was actually that naive. It was like, oh, we're just gonna, it's supposed to happen 21 days later. We'll do the booster vaccine 21 days later. And then it's like, well, I can't catch them right now, so we'll do it on Saturday because that's when I'm home. So part of it is what works for your cattle handling system too. So a lot of guys just do fall deworming, not because it's best in the fall, because they're working their pairs and they're castrating and they're sorting and they're weaning in the fall and they have them caught. So from a practicality standpoint, when it's easiest to handle them is probably the best time to deworm.
For the dewormer itself though, which stage of the liver flukes does it kill?
Oh, good question. I don't know. Those are all things, I mean, they're on the label, so I'd have to just go back and read the label, but I guess I don't know. Good question. I think some of them will kill adults too. Any other questions? Yep.
Is deer the primary carrier of liver flukes?
Yeah. Yep. So it's got a whitetail and a snail host.
I understand it's kind of like Bilharzia, which is a human disease.
Yeah, I guess I don't.
Got a human and a snail for a host.
Okay, sure.
Drop off.
You generally don't see liver flukes unless you're grazing near a pond,
Or a marsh.
some sort of standing water. Yep.
I have a question with the refugia. So if you decide to just not deworm, when you just not do it, or do you only do it once a year, or do you go either other year, or do you go out and buy a microscope and look at the feces? How do you decide when there's too much of the parasites in them that you should be deworming them?
Right. So the question is, how do I practically implement this idea of refugia? The way they do it in sheep, this is crazy, they actually grab each sheep, they pull its eyelid down, and if it's super pale, they're like, well, you're losing a lot of blood to parasites. You're gonna die if we don't do something, we should treat you. And then they treat that one, kick it out, grab the next one, look at it, they're like, you're good in pink, you're good. And they don't treat that one. We're not gonna do that with cattle. I think one practical way to start is if you don't see a visible clinical reason to deworm your adult cow, I would not deworm your adult cow. I think that's at least one way we can limit some of this. Your young stock are going to be loaded with them. I mean, we could run fecal samples and look, but I've done enough of those to know your young stock are just flat out going to be loaded up with parasites. But your adult cows typically are not. So I think that's one decent way to start. And the other way to start is the idea of deworming and then instantly kicking them to a new pasture is actually wrong. Deworm them and keep them where they're at makes more sense. Because then you're not going to take a pasture and load it up with a bunch of, that pasture will have susceptible ones in there from before you dewormed. Then you'll deworm, then you'll kick them back in, and they'll reinfect with more susceptible. I mean, it doesn't make sense that you actually want to deworm and then kick them back out to a population where they can reinfect, but at least if they are going to reinfect, it's with susceptible ones. You know what I'm saying? Good question. External parasites, so this is just classic lice. Right here is generally up around the shoulder. They're super itchy. I've seen this really impact weight gain and getting cows pregnant. I know a guy's got 15 beef cows. He didn't know what this was, and I think 8 of his beef cows didn't get pregnant, and I attribute a lot of that to lice, just because it was so irritating for them. These are easily controlled with most Poron products. Externals are not a big deal. Pretty much any Poron or injectable you use is going to get your externals. When it comes to flies, this is something I really like. Does anybody have one of these self-applicating oilers? The wick oilers are way more popular with people. The ones that the cattle walk under, you put like a end and some pyrethrin and some diesel and it wicks up and then they walk under them. But I think these brush oilers are better. It lets cattle rub on them, and you can put things in here that don't necessarily have to be chemical like porons. There's a lot of good botanical and natural things that you can use for fly control that if you have one of these styles, this generally holds, I think it's 5 gallons, and you can put a mixture of some oil or some diesel and some other product in here, and then it drips down, and when there's like a little trigger under here, and when they brush, it opens the valve up and then it applicates on them, and they can do it as often as they need. I think these are awesome for fly control. These are sold in the NASCO catalog. They make a cheaper one with one spring. See, there's a spring here and a spring here. I would recommend spend the extra money and get the double spring one because they work these things over really, really, really hard. Yep.
We have one of those mounted on a old baler frame, and pull it around the pastures, but our sons, they don't like if I use diesel oil.
Yep.
Diesel fuel. They think that can get into the meat.
Yeah, the idea of diesel fuel is creepy to me too. It's extremely widely used in the beef industry. There's other options. Most normal like food grade mineral oils are too thick to flow through this, but you can get some really, really light grade mineral oils, and that's typically what I promote. Just the idea of diesel fuel on something that I'm going to eat later does just inherently creep me out. Yep. And I think this is better than the wicking kind, because with the wicking ones, you're really stuck with diesel fuel. You're never going to get another carrier to wick up the wicking kind. So I think these are more flexible as far as what it allows you to do for options for fly control. The wicking ones work well, but you're pretty well stuck with diesel fuel or kerosene. Okay, going into some AI protocols here. So I'm really hard on beef cows, actually. I don't really think they have that much to do, and I think they need to do it well. And the first thing they need to do is get pregnant and stay pregnant. And if they can't do that, they're gone. Like I said, I am extremely judgmental of beef cows. The second thing they need to do is wean a profitable calf. If you can't do that, you're gone. And the third thing is don't go lame. In my opinion, you do these 3 things, you stay in the beef herd. The day comes you stop doing all 3 of these things, then you're probably not going to be around anymore. And so when it comes to getting pregnant, let's talk about getting beef cows pregnant. There's synchronization protocols. So many of you guys have jobs off the farm and you're not around all the time. So the idea of having a group of cows all come into heat at one time so you can breed them all in the same time is very advantageous for people that don't have bulls. And so we talk about synchronization protocols, and inherently people are going to want to start talking about what I sometimes think are fertility protocols, and I'm just against that. I've talked to beef producers, and sometimes they want to be like the dairy industry. Oh, I want to off-sync my cows. Why? You should just look at her and she should be pregnant almost. Oh, I want to do a cedar sync on my cow. Well, I tried lutein her and she didn't get pregnant, so now I'll do a cedar sync. Okay, well, we've done that in the dairy industry now, and we really struggle to get cows pregnant in the dairy industry because we work so hard doing these injection protocols to get them pregnant that we have inherently selected for cows that aren't fertile. So then we make up for it with more hormone shots, and then we get her pregnant, and she wasn't that fertile, and then she has a calf that's got a trait that's not that fertile. But that's okay, we'll make up for it with more hormone shots. So when it comes to me, my opinion is, if you want to sync some cows just for easy breeding, I think Lutulase and watch for heats is the best way to do it. And there's other things like OV syncs and cedar syncs and stuff that I guess I won't get into today. You can read details of that online if you want. But if you're going to AI, I really think lute and watch for heat in 3 days is a great way to do it. You're typically, if you do 100 cows, you're typically going to pick up 70 of them on your first wave of lute. So 70% of your cows you give Lutulase to will come into heat in 3 days. So you're not going to get everybody, but it is a nice way to sync up some cows if you're going to do that. Lots of ways to watch for heat. You got tail chalk, you can watch if it's rubbed off. You've got these little stickers that are like a lottery ticket. The more times they're mounted, it gets rubbed off. I really like these look good. And then you got these ones, it's like, this is white, and there's like a little vial of ink in there, and then when a cow mounts her, it gets smashed, and then the ink spreads out. I don't really love these. I think these are, you know, it's supposed to be so that if a quarter of it is red, she was in standing heat a couple hours ago. If half of it was red, she was 8 hours ago. If the full thing is red, it was 12 hours ago. But what do you do if the full thing is red? You don't know if it was 12 hours or 36 hours ago or whatever. So I kind of like, I like looking at these more and just doing daily observations on them. Any questions on AI stuff? How many people use bulls? Raise a hand. And how many people do AI? Sure. So still, I think beef industry is inherently dominated by bulls. But for people looking to get into AI, I do think and for the people doing AI who are doing any synchronization protocols. Yeah. And do you guys do loot and watch for heat, or do you guys do off syncs, or what? Just watch. Okay. Paint them and watch. Sure.
When you're talking 70% catching the first after the utilized, are you talking beef or dairy?
Really both. It's roughly 70%, probably more towards beef. You might not get 70% on dairy.
I've done both, and I think beef are really challenging, especially grass-fed.
Really?
It's energy level or what? But
So if they have a good CL and they're cycling, that's what they need to respond. And so they carry a CL over their 21-day cycle over a period of time that, generally speaking, that proportion of the time they should be responsive. And so maybe it's an issue, like you said, maybe they don't have the energy or something where they're not cycling. That could be. But they're inherently responsive to loot, provided that they have a good CL. Yep. 5 minutes. Let's get moving. Okay. So this is just my opinion. Okay. A lot of producers will focus on breeding to improve genetic progress and subsequent performance of their herd. I think genetics are important. Nutrition unlocks genetic potential for the animal. That's not arguable. Without exceptional nutrition first, the genetic potential will not be realized. When we were in vet school, they told us, there was some really interesting number, I can't remember the exact details, but if you wanted to get, this is for dairy, if you wanted to get another pound of milk out of a cow, nutrition could attribute maybe up to 80% of it, while genetics could only contribute up to 20% of it. So the point is, I don't want someone to misinterpret this. If you're not focusing on nutrition, don't waste your time and money focusing on genetics. It's a bold statement. There's a chance for misinterpretation with this. All I'm saying is, if somebody is really, really focused on the genetics of their animals, the nutrition has to be on par to allow that expression of the genetic potential. Without good nutrition, all the genetic potential in the world is squandered. So I'm just going to leave it at that before. Pregnancy testing options. So did they calve in the spring, which means no checking. That's one way to know for sure if she was pregnant, was there's a calf on the ground. Another way is veterinary palpation. In my opinion, obviously I'm biased, it's quick, reliable, relatively cheap. Question around here is it available? And then there's some blood testing options. I'm not very familiar with these, but I asked Lynn if he would just share some experiences with this. As far as it being quick, it's not as quick as a vet just sleeving it and telling you. But I think it's reasonable as far as the price, and I think it's maybe a little more available as well, because you guys can pull your own blood samples with a little bit of training.
The skill involved is really being able to collect that milliliter of blood, and it just takes a little training and a practice to get that. So you have a blood sample, you take it to the lab or send it to the lab, and you can get a result back, yes or no, pregnant or open. And that costs about $3.50, a little more, closer to $5 when you count some of the other inputs. The idea is you have a yes/no response, so it's up to you to keep good records and be able to use that yes/no answer in a cost-effective way. And there is a lab near Shell Lake here that can do that. The literature is on the back, the display there.
And $5 is so much cheaper than feeding an open cow through the winter. So I think it's an important thing to do. And last one, addressing calving problems. So we've all been here before. Okay, so the first thing that they told us in vet school, lube, 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 and lube if you have a calving issue. It'll be your best friend for sure. And in the absence of a good lubricant, things like dish soap or something can use. But oftentimes trying to grease the wheel to get the baby out is one of the most important things. And a lot of times I would go out to a farm and people have been trying and they're frustrated, and I might not do hardly anything other than introduce a little lubrication in there, and oftentimes the calf would come out. So just always having some lube on hand, and then patience, patience, and patience is the other thing. A lot of guys are the ones doing the calvings. A lot of guys are inherently less patient, maybe, might be a safe statement. Yep.
I think that this is a good point to interject a little bit about genetics, because calving ease is a trait that can be selected in your full selection criteria, and calving difficulties are preventable by simply making good choices in full selection for calving ease, so you don't have the problem in the first place. And that's one of the traits I think is worth putting genetics first in your criteria, because genetics is your way of introducing that into your full battery. And accuracy in calving ease, PDFs on bull book and so on are very useful tools to prevent calving problems.
Yeah, I think Lynn's point is really valuable. I mean, the point of a beef cow is really ideally we should never have to assist in a calving. And I think selecting for calving ease is super important. When I say nutrition unlocks genetic potential, I'm talking things about average daily gain, calf weaning weights, that kind of stuff. So, okay, so give them time to calve. That's the first thing. Cows, at least an hour. Heifers, 2 to 3 hours. And what I mean by that is if progress is being made. So if you see some feet and the start of a nose and you come back 40 minutes later and half the head's out, she's making progress. Please do not interfere. She's doing fine. Heifers, we give them up to 2 to 3 hours. Now, if there's not progress made, she's laboring and you just see one foot coming out and nothing's happened in 2 hours, well, then we know that there's a problem. But as long as there's advancement happening in that time period, it's best to just let Mother Nature take its course. Interestingly enough, it may seem like the right thing to do if the calf seems stressed is to run out there and pull it, but study after study has shown the more we intervene, the more dead calves we actually have. The more we let cows just do birth on their own, actually the higher success rate we have in live calves. So, interesting data. Number one cause of calving problems is fetal positioning is inappropriate. So we have like, here's a foot back, here's 2 feet back, here's a head back, here's all messed up. There's actually nothing wrong with this. This is fine. Coming backwards like this is okay. And this is breech. So these can all be particularly challenging. But really, this is probably the number one cause that I see for beef animals is just fetal positioning is wrong, and it's all about just straightening them out. I always say you need 2 and. So you need 2 feet and a head coming, or 2 feet and a tail coming. But if you don't have 2 feet and, you can't pull. And I've seen some guys try pulling on 2 feet and the head's back. It'll just never happen. So as long as you can see 2 feet in the head or 2 feet and touch the tail, you know you're good to pull. The other problem is just size mismatch, a small dam and a bigger calf. So you're going to have to pull it. Some calves aren't going to fit. If it's alive, the vet can do a C-section. If it's dead, they'll cut the calf up in the cow and then pull it out in pieces. Assisted calvings like this, I get nervous with the calf puller. These things can generate over 2,000 pounds of pulling force on the calf if you're not careful with them. So calf pullers can be really useful, but they are really they can really be detrimental to the cow as well. We call this an Alabama C-section. Okay, if it's not going to fit and you need the tractor, don't do an Alabama C-section. When you're putting wraps on the calf, I always like to double wrap. I see people very commonly just do single wraps, and so you want to get the first wrap up above the fetlock and then the second wrap up above the dew claws. This will make it much, much, much less likely that a calf will have a broken leg. Yep.
When you talk about selecting a bull for birthing beef, are you talking about, what are you saying? Low birth weight?
For calving ease,
Yeah.
They generally just have indexes, right? I'm not a big genetics guy. Sorry, admittedly, I have to say genetics is my least favorite part of animals in general. I got to be honest here. I just slept through those parts in class. I think most bull studs have like it's just an index, right? Like a calving index that would generally say on a is it 1 through 5 or something? Lynn, maybe you can.
Yeah, the calving needs indexes for bulls and AI are readily available and they have different levels of accuracy. So the bull books provide that information. If you're using a natural service sire, then obviously the breed and the genetics of that pedigree of that bull is useful. But if you have more questions along that line, I'd be happy to help you work that through.
Generally speaking, it just means that they tend to throw smaller calves. Yep, yep, yep. So I think that's, oh, this is the last thing. I know I'm going long, but this is the most important part of the whole deal. Okay, how do you know if it's gonna fit and if you can keep pulling it? If you got 2 feet and a head coming, if you can get a hand's width above the fetlock joint, okay, so right here, here's the fetlock joint. This guy can get a hand's width from the vulva of the cow to here. This calf will come, guaranteed. And we know it because if you can get a hand's width between the fetlock and the back end of the cow, back here, this calf's shoulders have already engaged the pelvic canal and they're making it through. Does that make sense? So if you can get it out to here, it will come. This is where lube and patience come in. On a backwards calf, if you can get the hand width above the hock, this calf physically has to make it because we know that the pelvis has already engaged the pelvic canal of the cow. So if you can get them out a hand width above the hock or above the fetlock, they will physically fit. Then it's time to just go slow.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.